Hi, I'm Tim Barton.
And I'm Jonathan Richie.
And we're here at the American Journey Experience, where we are housing a combination of some really amazing artifacts. We have about 160,000 items and artifacts from American history, and it really is one of the largest collections in the world.
In fact, we have things that go all the way back to an oil lamp out of King David's palace from the biblical times, to things that even went to the moon. And we use those to tell the true story about America's history, looking at things from original documents and finding out what actually happened in America's past.
You know, Jonathan, as we look at culture today, one of the things that seems to be lost is the ability for people to go back and learn the real story from original documents. So often now people are looking online, they're doing some basic searches, or they've heard a professor say something. And there's so much of the narrative today that is a critical depiction of American history, which, if it was true, it would be acceptable because you accept the truth. But what's happening today is there's a literal rewriting of American history in spite of original documents and artifacts, and maybe just rejecting those documents and artifacts to tell a story that's more politically motivated than it is historically honest.
Absolutely, and I think there's so many voices nowadays. You mentioned, right, people just go on Google, and how often do they ever go to the second page of Google, right? They just take whatever is kind of first presented to them. That's why we've spent so many years collecting these original artifacts, because then we can actually present them with the honest truth, right? Because then it's not your word, it's not some professor's word, it's literally what happened, and we have things from that time. And we can look at almost every single aspect of America's history, from going all the way back to the original discovery by Christopher Columbus, to the American founding, to even things more recently, and we can see kind of a different story is being told than what actually happened.
So what we want to do is we want to go on a journey through American history. And as we do this, we're going to use original documents and artifacts. And so, as we mentioned, Christopher Columbus is kind of where most people know the story of America, where it begins. So let's back up to Christopher Columbus. What most people know from Christopher Columbus is that in 1492,
Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right?
And that's probably what most people remember or learned along the way. And the reality is there's so much more to the story of Columbus that today very few people know the actual story of Columbus. For example, Columbus had more than one voyage to America, which is shocking for most people to discover, but the reality is he had 4 voyages, and those voyages were very different. And today, in modern culture, there's a lot of people very critical of Christopher Columbus. In fact, over the last couple of years, when there was a movement to tear down statues, Christopher Columbus had over 600 statues erected to him around the world, and the vast majority of those statues were torn down, were vandalized, because people now view Christopher Columbus as a bad, evil person. But it's worth asking the question, if he was bad, was he bad on the first, second, third, or fourth voyage? And the reason that matters is, if you don't know the story of the voyages, how do you know he even was bad in the first place?
Yeah, and it's as you go back, you see this isn't necessarily even the first time that people have started attacking historical figures. And what I have here is actually a volume out of Washington Irving's 3-volume Life of Columbus. This was done in 1828, and it was really one of the first serious historical inquiries into who Columbus was, what he did, why he's important and significant. And Washington Irving actually highlights this spirit of kind of tearing down monuments that we see so often today, and he highlights it in a very significant way, and I'd like to read you what he says. He says, "There is a certain meddlesome spirit which, in the garb of learned research, goes prying about the traces of history, casting down its monuments, and marring and mutilating its fairest trophies. Care should be taken to vindicate great names from such pernicious erudition. It defeats one of the most salutary purposes of history, that of furnishing examples of what human genius and laudable enterprise may accomplish." And it's, I mean, even though this was written back in 1828, it almost sounds like it was written last year, because every single Columbus Day, which comes around every year, more places, more cities, states, and jurisdictions are saying, no, let's not celebrate Columbus Day, let's do something else. People say maybe something like Indigenous Peoples Day, but they're really tearing down these monuments of Columbus without even knowing what Columbus even did.
Right, and so let's go through this, because some of the accusations we hear today is, right, Columbus, the genocide of the Native Americans, the enslavement of the Native Americans. You hear a lot of negative things today. So let's just back up. Let's walk through this first voyage, and even why was Columbus going in this sailing expedition in the first place? Because if he's really looking for a trade route to India, right, there's other options, except at that time there were some issues with the trade routes.
Yeah, well, during this time, Columbus is kind of growing up in Spain. Spain itself is still trying to reconquer itself after some of the Muslim jihads in the medieval period, which had conquered all of North Africa, had even invaded Spain, had almost gotten up to France, but they had really shut off the overland trade routes to get to India. And so people in the West, such as Columbus and the rulers of Spain and Portugal and England, were starting to look at different options of how do we get to India, how do we get to the spices, the goods, the trade routes there without going overland. And so some people like the Portuguese started sailing down the African coast trying to figure out, okay, can we even get around Africa? Because they didn't know even where Africa ended at that point. And Columbus starts reading the old histories and science books from going back to the ancient Greeks and the Romans and early scientists, and he starts to develop this idea of, I think we can just sail that way across the Atlantic and we'll eventually reach India.
The idea that the Earth was a globe, he didn't know the scale, right? It was a little off on the size, but the idea that this is this round ball, let's just sail around it and it might be a lot better. And so, like even today, he gets credit for discovering America. Technically, he didn't really discover America, and if we're really honest and kind of go back officially, there were Vikings. There were other people who had landed on mainland North America. Obviously, there were Native Americans here, so Columbus was not the first guy, but as far as the Western world was concerned, nobody had really done what he did, and then to come back with the stories he had. So let's walk through that. So Columbus goes on this journey across the ocean and discovers some islands.
Yeah, so he gets there, and this he thinks is India, but obviously he's a little bit mistaken because he's run into North, Central, and South America, which really nobody knew was even there on the map. And so he gets there and he starts to explore, goes from island to island, and he runs into some of the natives there, which are known as the Taino or Taino tribe. They're part of the Arawak language group, and you can kind of find out a lot more about those. There's a lot of rich history, but he finds them and begins to try to communicate with them. He had actually brought guys who, knew various language, Arabic, a whole bunch of different things, hopefully to be able to communicate with the people that he found there. And so he starts this process of really the old world and the new world coming together. It's one of the most significant moments in world history where all of a sudden you have these, Spaniards, and Columbus himself is an Italian, but he's leading Spanish ships, and they discover this world that had been untouched by outside society for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and trying to navigate that, not necessarily conflict, but that
clash
meeting
of
cultures,
yeah.
Right?
And this is where also what's interesting, as you noted, he was an Italian selling for a Spanish nation because they're the ones who funded him, right? Ferdinand and Isabella funded him. We actually have a pretty cool document going back when Columbus first sailed. It was 1492. This is a legal document from King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella from 1493. So this is literally the era of Columbus sailing the ocean blue on this first voyage. This is an official governing document from Spain.
Yeah, you can actually see the signatures of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella right here and here. So this is Lore, the king, Lorena, the queen. And so this is a really cool document from that period where Columbus is leaving from Spain. And Columbus was actually kind of good friends with Queen Isabella. They were known as the Catholic monarchs because they had finally reconquered all of the Iberian Peninsula, pushing back the Muslims who had obviously invaded earlier. And they were very significant figures in the world at that point when they decide to equip Columbus with 3 ships, right? The Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria, and then let Columbus kind of sail off into the Atlantic Ocean, attempting to do what really very few, basically nobody had ever done before. And then what makes Columbus stand out from even some of those Vikings is that he comes back and he publishes it, right? He spreads the word, and then he's able to bring people back and actually accomplish the voyage, not just a second time, but a third time and a fourth time as well.
So after he has 3 ships, Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria, they discover the islands. Interestingly enough, he doesn't return with 3 ships. There's obviously some stories surrounding that with maybe who was supposed to be on watch and who didn't take care. And so one of the ships ends up getting grounded. And so they're not able to return. Now, at this point, they've made contact with the Taino. Interesting, there's a letter from Columbus back to the Queen and King where he acknowledges that this Taino tribe, they're a really impressive people.